I'm a small female living alone in a large city. Knowing exactly what this could mean for me, I'm pretty wary of my surroundings and the people in it. I recently moved to the back of an apartment complex, to the 3rd floor, which I was very excited about since I hate being on the ground level. A few days after moving in, I met my across-the-way neighbor, Steve. Steve was tall and skinny with dark hair and trying for a beard. He was nice, polite in our few passings, but we never had more than an exchange of a few hellos, until one Saturday night. My friend dropped me off at my place late that night, and I stumbled up the stairs, stupid drunk. I knew I was making a racket because Steve opened his door as I approached mine. I waved at him and smiled as I fumbled for my keys. I was facing my door, trying to remember which key it was, as they all looked the same, and I felt Steve come up behind me. He grabbed my hands with the keys and breathed, "Let me help," and immediately found the correct key and helped me put it into the keyhole. It could have been romantic, looking back, if this guy hadn't proceeded to stick his nose into my hair and take a deep, shaky breath. The red alarms immediately started going off in my head and cut through my drunken stupor. My breath was frozen in my throat, and I realized just how fucked I could possibly be. "Thanks," I mumbled before slipping through my door and locking it behind me. I stood there for a moment, going, "What the fuck?" when I heard a soft thump on the other side of the door. I slowly turned and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything, only blackness, which didn't make any sense because there was a light outside which kept the staircase lit. I blinked and stepped back before checking again. This time, I saw Steve backing away from the peephole. My body felt like it was dunked in ice water. Steve went back into his apartment and I didn't hear anything else that night. For a few weeks after that, I would hear the same soft thump and find Steve trying to peer into my apartment from the peephole. I could hear his heavy breathing. Sometimes he would even paw at the door, but he never came out when I would come home after the first time. I never called the cops. I probably should have, but Steve was my neighbor, and I didn't want to stir up any animosity that I would have to deal with. Steve moved out 2 weeks ago. This is my dad's story, which I can verify. Back in the 1960s, my dad and a buddy decided to travel the world. They went to a number of places, including Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand. It was in Australia when my dad and his friend were approached by a man. Now, note that it was obvious that they were tourists. They had their backpacks on and a Canadian flag patch on each. A man approached the two of them and struck up a conversation. My dad says instantly he got a bad vibe from the guy, but for the sake of being polite, my dad and his friend, who isn't known for his sense of self-preservation, continued chatting to him. The man asked my dad and his friend if they had any place to stay. When they admitted that they didn't, the man said, "You know, I've got a buddy who lives just a short bit away. In fact, there's a whole community who'd love tourists. I'll give you two a ride." Dad instantly got red flags and told the guy no. He seemed to get pissed and kept insisting, but Dad and his friend kept insisting that they would be fine. Finally, he left, and the two found somewhere else to stay. Years later, Dad told me the story, and I got curious and decided to do some digging. I went into a Wikipedia page and I pointed out the picture of the man to Dad, and it matched. The man that they encountered was Ivan Milat, a serial killer who was famous for the backpack murders. His first killing started in 1989 when my dad and his friend went to Australia. He has killed approximately between 7 to 12 people. I'm glad that my dad listened to his gut and didn't go with him. Otherwise, he would have not met my mother and later adopted me and my little sister. I hate to think that my dad and his friend could have been the first victims of a serial killer. It all started on St. Patrick's Day, in a small town, when I met a lanky guy that seemed like fun company. The sun was setting, and he said he had some fireworks he could show off, and, having never seen fireworks up close, I agreed. Me, him, and a mutual friend walked to his house, and the fireworks were disappointing, but at least not dangerous. On the way back to town, we started flirting. Now, he was tall, very tall compared to me. I'd say definitely over 6 foot, and I'm about 5'3". I thought he was kinda cute, so I flirted back. He decided to say, "I almost want to make a move, but I don't want to scare you." I said, "Go ahead," and he grabbed me. He licked my neck and grabbed my crotch through my jeans. I was shocked. No one had seen this happen except the three of us in a dark alley at around 8 p.m. Somehow, I forgave him. I thought he was just, I don't know, bad at these things, that maybe he was drunk or tired or something. I remained friends with him. He was one of the only friends I had. It was now summer. I was bored. I went to his house, alone, without telling my parents, because they'd just be worried for no reason. It looked dusty and old, like peeling paint and a blanket of dust in some rooms, and something didn't feel right at all. I heard a dog, and it sounded big, but it was in the yard. When I went into his bedroom, he closed the door, and there were holes in it, all over it, holes and slices. When he's mad, he stabs his door, he told me. I was between him and the door. I remember looking past him and seeing a fish tank before hearing something and flinching. He had thrown a knife into the door. It was impaled into the wood next to me, and now he was laughing because I flinched. "I knew that would scare you," was what he said. I looked back at the fish tank. It was loud. He opened the door. He told me something that still haunts me. He looked me right in the eyes, so close, and at least a foot taller. Oddly, I remember his nose more than his eyes, with how close it was. In a tone somewhere between small talk and the kind of sound like you were contemplating someone's looks. "I could kill you so easily right now." Struggling to keep the fear out of my voice, after a forced laugh, I said that I'd rather sit outside together rather than inside with all the dust. I then told him I was going to go get us some ice creams because he was not allowed to leave his house after his last suicide threat. I tried to keep steady as I walked in the general direction of the Carvel. I made sure I was out of his sight. I called my mom and asked to be picked up. I told her I wanted to be picked up because I was bored. She said she could get me in an hour. I decided to spend that hour on the other side of town, in the library. She said something like I looked sick. I told her it was just the heat, and she believed me. I just found this sub, and I wanted to share my own experience. It happened when I was 13, and it's something I've never forgotten. We had just moved into a brand new house in a brand new housing development. A lot of the houses around us were either unfinished or had families that had just moved in. Behind our house was a lot of field, mostly for more future houses. We lived in a fairly safe, small city, and the housing development was very quiet. So for the first few years we lived there, we never bothered to lock the doors. Even at night, most of the time, it just wasn't something we thought about. My parents had just put in hardwood floor, so the house was a pretty echoey single story. One night, as I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard the back sliding glass door open. I was up late on the internet, but everyone else was asleep, so the house was quiet. I had my door slightly open so my cat could come and go, and so I knew that I was definitely hearing something. I froze, hoping it wasn't the door, but a moment later, I heard it slide shut. Then, I began to hear what sounded like heavy shoes walking across the hardwood floor. It was a very specific sound, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe. The footsteps were slow and quiet, like they were trying to make as little noise as possible, but because the floor was wood and our house had high ceilings, the steps echoed down the hallway to my room. Then I heard them stop. The sound of the hallway closet being opened, and then the door quietly clicking shut, like they turned the knob, pulled the door closed, and then released the knob once it was in place. It was silent after that. My heart was beating so fast, and I began crying. The only way to my parents' room was up the hallway. Their door was only about 20 feet from where the hallway closet was. I was frozen, and I honestly thought I would pee in my pants. I was so scared. However, it was silent for long enough that I knew I had to get my dad. So I stood up and walked sock-footed to my door. I stood there for a long time breathing. It's not a long hallway, but I went as fast as I could. I got inside the room and tried to wake my dad up. "Dad! Dad!" I was frantically whispering. "Huh?" He was half asleep. "Dad!" "Huh? What?" "Dad, I think there's someone inside the house." "What?" "Get up. I think there's someone inside the house." "There's no one in here. Go back to sleep." "Yes, there is." I start crying. That gets him up. My mom also wakes up at this point as well, so they both get out of bed. My dad, sure there's no one in the house, doesn't even grab something as a weapon, but I follow behind him as he leaves the room. He goes into the living room, passes the closet, turns on all the lights in the house. I remember standing in the living room, knowing exactly where the person was, and not being able to say anything. He tells me, "Look, there's no one here." He doesn't check the closet though, and I don't tell him to. I'm so afraid that whoever's in there will jump out with a knife and kill my dad in front of me, and 13-year-old me keeps thinking I can't be the one responsible for my dad's death. So I say nothing, and I don't tell him to check the closet. I don't know why he didn't, because if I were a dad, I would have. He locks the front door and tells me to go back to bed. They wait until I'm back in my room before they close their own bedroom door and go back to sleep. Again, the house is silent, and I'm laying there afraid because that person is still in here, in the one place he didn't look. Suddenly, I hear the closet door open, just as slowly and as quietly as before. Then, the footsteps again. I could hear them so clearly walking towards the kitchen where the back door is, and they stop. That's followed by the sound of the back door being slid open, and then quietly being pushed closed again. I hear the back door click into place, and then the house is silent. I'm laying there crying and breathing, but hearing them leave the house, I felt instant relief, though I was still shaking with fear. I give it a few minutes hoping they wouldn't come back, and they don't. So after a bit, I sneak out there. My one and only thought is to lock the back door, which I managed to do. But the scariest part was that when I looked at the hall closet, the door wasn't closed anymore. It was cracked, because they hadn't bothered to close it after they left, though I know it was definitely closed when my dad was out there with me. I tried bringing it up to them years later, and they still didn't believe me. But that's not something you just hear